It was a typical Friday evening when the thought struck me. Something didn't feel right. My wife, Emily, was heading out for another one of her infamous girls' nights. She had been going on these nights out with her friends more frequently over the past few months. At first, I didn't think much of it. She deserved to unwind, and I trusted her. But lately, the trust felt more like a burden than a bond. Little details weren't adding up. The way she'd rush off without her usual excitement, the new dresses that appeared out of nowhere, and the faint scent of cologne on her clothes when she returned home late. Still, I told myself it was nothing. I was probably overthinking, right? After all, we'd been married for 10 years. We'd built a life together, weathered storms, and shared dreams. She wouldn't betray that, would she? That Friday, as Emily prepared to leave, I sat at the kitchen counter, pretending to scroll through my phone. She walked in, dressed in a sleek black dress I'd never seen before, her makeup done more elaborately than usual. She looked stunning, but something about her appearance set off alarms in my mind. "You look amazing," I said casually, forcing a smile. "Big plans with the girls?" She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a tiny pause that I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't been watching her so closely. Then, she smiled brightly and said, "Yeah, just the usual. Don't wait up, okay?" "Of course," I replied, keeping my tone light. But as the door clicked shut behind her, I made a decision. I was going to follow her. For the first time in our marriage, I felt compelled to see where she was really going. I hated myself for it, but the gnawing suspicion in my gut was stronger than my guilt. Grabbing my keys, I slipped out the back door and climbed into my car, parking a safe distance behind hers as she drove off. It wasn't long before I realized she wasn't heading to her friend's house. Instead, her car took a series of turns that led her downtown. My chest tightened as I watched her pull into the parking lot of a nightclub, a place we'd never been together, one I didn't even know she frequented. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I parked nearby, my heart pounding in my ears. I waited a few minutes before stepping out of the car. The air was cool, and the sound of music thumped faintly from the club's doors. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, but I pushed forward, entering the dimly lit nightclub and scanning the crowd for Emily. It didn't take long to find her. There she was, sitting at the bar, laughing and leaning in close to a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, confident, and had his hand resting casually on her knee as if he belonged there. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was betrayal. I stood frozen, watching as the woman I thought I knew betrayed every ounce of trust I'd placed in her. My mind raced, a storm of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, heartbreak, disbelief. I wanted to march over, confront them, demand answers. But something held me back. No, not yet. I needed to stay calm, to understand how far this had gone, to figure out who I was dealing with and why Emily thought she could play me for a fool. This wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. I left the club before my emotions got the better of me, my mind buzzing with questions and possibilities. Driving home, the image of Emily laughing with that man played over and over in my head. My knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. I didn't even know his name, but I hated him already. More than that, I hated her. For lying, for shattering the trust we'd built. But mixed in with the anger was something else. A deep, aching sadness. How had it come to this? I parked the car in our driveway and sat there in silence, staring at the darkened windows of our house. It felt so different now, like a stranger's home instead of my sanctuary. My thoughts were a tangled mess, veering wildly between confrontation and revenge. But I knew rushing into anything would only give her the upper hand. Instead, I needed a plan. I needed to be smart about this. Emily wasn't the kind of person who left loose ends, and if she was bold enough to meet another man in public, she probably thought she had nothing to fear. That arrogance would be her undoing. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling as my thoughts raced. I replayed every suspicious moment from the past few months, piecing together a puzzle I hadn't even realized I'd been assembling. The late nights, the new clothes, the sudden distance between us. It all made sense now. By morning, I had made up my mind. This wasn't just about catching her in the act anymore. This was about reclaiming my dignity. If she thought she could make a fool out of me, she was sorely mistaken. Over the next few days, I started gathering evidence. I knew her schedule inside and out, so it wasn't hard to figure out when she'd be out with the girls again. I waited for her to leave, then followed her once more. This time, she didn't go to the same nightclub. Instead, she drove to a hotel on the edge of town. I stayed in my car, parked a safe distance away, and watched as she met the same man from before in the hotel lobby. They didn't even try to hide it. He kissed her cheek, and they walked arm in arm to the elevator. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to stay focused. I snapped a few photos with my phone, making sure to capture their faces clearly. It was undeniable now. She wasn't just sneaking around. She was fully involved with this guy. And the thought of it made my blood boil. When Emily came home that night, she acted like nothing was wrong. She kissed my cheek, asked how my day had been, and even joked about how tired she was after hanging out with her friends. I played along, smiling and nodding, but inside, I was a storm waiting to break. "You've been going out a lot lately," I said casually as we sat down for dinner. "Everything okay?" She looked up from her plate, her expression unreadable. "Of course. Why do you ask?" "Just wondering," I replied, keeping my tone light. "It seems like you've been really busy lately." She laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You know how it is. Work's been stressful, and the girls' nights help me unwind." I nodded, pretending to believe her. "That makes sense. I'm glad you're taking time for yourself." If she noticed anything unusual in my tone, she didn't let it show. But as we cleared the table and she headed upstairs, I felt the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. I needed to dig deeper, to uncover the full extent of her betrayal. And when the time came, I would make sure she couldn't talk her way out of it. But I wasn't just going to sit back and play detective. No, I needed to remind myself of who I was before all of this. Before the lies, the heartbreak, the second-guessing. Emily had chipped away at my confidence, but I wasn't going to let her take everything from me. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. I went for a run, something I hadn't done in years, letting the cool air clear my head. I spent the afternoon organizing my thoughts, planning my next moves, and figuring out how to protect myself from whatever storm Emily was brewing behind my back. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about me, rebuilding, becoming stronger, and taking control of my life. And when the time came to confront her, I'd make sure she felt every ounce of the pain she had caused me. I wasn't just going to catch her. I was going to make her regret ever underestimating me. The following week, Emily was her usual self, warm, bubbly, and completely fake. If I hadn't seen her with my own eyes, I might have believed the act. She cooked dinner one night, a rare gesture these days, and even suggested we plan a weekend trip together. I played along, smiling and nodding, all the while biting back the anger that simmered beneath the surface. But her perfect wife performance wasn't fooling me anymore. I'd seen the truth, and I couldn't unsee it. She wasn't doing this because she cared. She was doing it to maintain the illusion. That Friday, she mentioned another girls' night. I didn't even flinch when she brought it up. "Go ahead," I said with a smile. "You deserve it." Her eyes flickered for the briefest moment, like she was surprised by my easy acceptance. Then she leaned over and kissed my cheek. "Thanks, babe. You're the best." I watched her leave, and as soon as the door closed, I sprang into action. This time, I wasn't just going to follow her. I wanted to know everything: where she went, who she met, and how long she stayed. I'd installed a tracking app on her phone earlier that week, something I hated myself for doing, but I knew it was necessary. I waited for her to reach her destination before I left the house. Checking the app, I saw her location ping at a familiar spot, the hotel from before. My stomach churned as I drove there, parking a few blocks away. Inside the lobby, I kept my distance, blending into the crowd as I watched her meet the same man. This time, they didn't even bother with pleasantries. They were laughing, holding hands, completely comfortable with each other. The sight made my blood boil, but I stayed calm, snapping more photos and recording a video. They headed upstairs together, and I waited. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Some grand revelation? A confession? Instead, I just felt hollow. The woman I had built my life with was upstairs with another man, and I was standing here like a ghost, watching it all unfold. After an hour, they came back down, their arms casually around each other. I followed them at a distance as they left the hotel, getting into his car and driving off. I tailed them carefully, my heart pounding as I wondered where they were headed next. To my shock, they pulled into a nightclub, the same one I had followed her to the first time. I parked a few blocks away and walked inside, the thumping bass reverberating in my chest. The place was crowded, but it didn't take long to spot them. They were at a booth near the back, leaning into each other, completely oblivious to the world around them. Her hand was on his chest, and he was whispering something in her ear that made her laugh. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, torn between confronting them and walking away. But then something happened, something I hadn't planned for. A waitress approached their table, delivering drinks. As she placed the glasses down, Emily glanced up and froze. She had spotted me. For a split second, our eyes locked across the room. Her face went pale, and she quickly pulled her hand away from the man's chest. But it was too late. The damage was done. I didn't move. I just stood there, letting her see the hurt and anger in my eyes. The man turned to look at me, confused, but Emily grabbed his arm and whispered something to him. He frowned, glancing at me again, before standing up and walking toward the exit. Emily stayed behind, her hands trembling as she stared down at the table. I made my way toward her slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached her, she finally looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan," she began, her voice shaking. "I can explain." "Don't," I cut her off, my voice low but steady. "I've seen enough." She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "How long has this been going on, Emily? How long have you been lying to me?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel sympathy. Not anymore. "It's not what you think," she said weakly. I scoffed. "Not what I think. You're sitting here with another man, acting like you're on a date, and you want to tell me it's not what I think." She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "That's what you're going with?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You didn't mean for this to happen? You didn't mean to betray me?" She flinched, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in her expression. But then she straightened her shoulders, her face hardening. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone cold now. "But maybe if you'd paid more attention to me, things wouldn't have turned out this way." Her words hit me like a slap to the face. Any remaining shred of doubt or regret I felt vanished in that moment. "I see," I said, nodding slowly. "So this is my fault, is it? You betray me, and I'm the one to blame?" She didn't answer, just looked away, her jaw tight. I stood there for a moment, staring at the woman I had once loved, and felt something inside me break. But it wasn't sadness, it was resolve. "I hope he's worth it," I said quietly. Then I turned and walked away, leaving her sitting there in the crowded nightclub. Alone with her lies, I walked out of that nightclub, feeling hollow. The anger, the heartbreak, the disbelief, all of it churned inside me, but for the first time, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Emily's betrayal wasn't some fleeting mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a choice, a deliberate act that she had repeated again and again, without a shred of concern for the life we had built together. Driving home, I realized something. I wasn't the same man who had walked into that nightclub the first time. That man had been hesitant, unsure of himself, desperate to find a way to fix things. But now, I was done. Done pretending everything was okay. Done doubting my instincts. Done being the man who let people walk all over him. When I got home, the house felt different. Emptier, colder, like it no longer belonged to me. I poured myself a drink and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photos and videos I'd collected over the past few days. This was it. The evidence. Proof of her betrayal. I thought about confronting her again, laying it all out and demanding an explanation. But what was the point? She'd already shown me who she was. She wasn't going to apologize or beg for forgiveness. No, She'd twist it all around, try to justify her actions, maybe even blame me again. No, that wasn't going to happen. I wasn't giving her the satisfaction of controlling the narrative. If she wanted a war, she was about to see just how far I was willing to go. Over the next few days, I started putting my plan into motion. I met with a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Claire who didn't flinch when I told her the whole story. She's been cheating on me for months, I said, sliding the photos and videos across her desk. Claire studied the evidence, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "This is solid," she said after a moment. "You have enough here to make a strong case for infidelity. But what do you want, Ethan? Do you want to end things quickly, or are you looking for something more decisive?" Her question hung in the air, and I knew what she meant. This wasn't just about divorce. It was about taking control, about making sure Emily understood the full weight of her actions. "I want her to feel it," I said quietly, my voice steady. "I want her to know what it's like to lose everything she took for granted." Claire nodded, a small, approving smile playing on her lips. "Good. Then we're going to do this the right way. No shortcuts, no second chances." She outlined a plan, one that involved not just filing for divorce, but also securing my financial assets and documenting every instance of her infidelity. I followed her advice to the letter, setting up accounts in my name, consolidating my finances, and gathering every piece of evidence I could find. Meanwhile, I started making changes in my personal life. I hit the gym every morning, channeling my anger into something productive. I reconnected with old friends I hadn't seen in years, people who reminded me of who I was before Emily had chipped away at my confidence. It was during one of these workouts that I ran into Chris, an old college buddy who worked in cybersecurity. I hadn't seen him in years, but when I told him about what was going on, he offered to help. "You want to know everything about this guy she's seeing?" Chris asked, a mischievous grin on his face. "Everything," I said without hesitation. Chris worked fast. Within days, he had uncovered the man's identity, Daniel Ford. He was a real estate agent who worked out of the city, single, and apparently very comfortable spending money on expensive dinners and hotel stays. But the most interesting part? He had a bit of a history, multiple complaints from clients accusing him of fraud and shady business practices. "Sounds like a winner," Chris said, handing me a file filled with Daniel's details. I thanked him and spent the evening poring over the information, my mind racing with possibilities. Emily had traded our life for this guy? A liar and a cheat? The irony wasn't lost on me. But I wasn't just going to expose Daniel's secrets. No, I had something bigger in mind, something that would hit both of them where it hurt. The next time Emily announced she was going out, I didn't follow her. Instead, I stayed home and finalized my preparations. I'd hired a private investigator to dig even deeper into Daniel's background, and the results were even better than I'd hoped. There were court records, debt, and even an ex-girlfriend who had filed a restraining order against him. When Emily came home that night, I was waiting for her. She walked through the door, her heels clicking against the floor, and paused when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table, a manila envelope in front of me. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Have a seat," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. She hesitated, but then she sat down, folding her hands in her lap like a child caught sneaking candy. I slid the envelope across the table. "Open it." Her hands shook slightly as she pulled out the contents, photos, documents, and a detailed timeline of her affair with Daniel. Her face turned pale as she flipped through the pages. Where did you get this?" she stammered. "I told you," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I've seen enough." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan, Save it." I cut her off. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I just wanted you to see what I've been dealing with. You think you've been so clever, sneaking around behind my back. But the truth? You've been sloppy. And now, it's all out in the open." Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for the right words, but none came. "This is just the beginning," I said, standing up. "You wanted to live your life without me? Fine. But you're going to learn that actions have consequences." I walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there with the evidence of her betrayal spread out in front of her. I spent the next few days laying low, giving Emily just enough space to stew in the aftermath of our conversation. She didn't say much, and when she did, it was half-hearted attempts at normalcy, asking if I wanted coffee or mentioning something trivial about her day. I barely responded. I wasn't interested in playing along anymore. Behind the scenes, though, my plan was in full swing. I'd already filed for divorce, and my lawyer, Claire, had set up a temporary order freezing our joint accounts to ensure Emily couldn't drain them in a panic. The private investigator had come through with even more dirt on Daniel, and it painted a picture of a man who lived recklessly, making enemies everywhere he went. He wasn't just shady, he was dangerous. But the real trump card? I'd uncovered something about Emily I never expected. While reviewing our financial records, I discovered she'd been funneling money from our accounts into a private savings account, one I hadn't known about. It wasn't much at first, but over the months, the amount had grown suspiciously large. I couldn't figure out if it was for her new life with Daniel or just a safety net in case things went south. But either way, it was evidence of her duplicity. I brought it to Claire, who was thrilled. "This is gold," she said, flipping through the documents. "It shows premeditation, which is going to hurt her in court. Judges don't like to see one spouse siphoning funds without the other's knowledge." I nodded, my resolve hardening. Emily had underestimated me in every way, and I was going to make sure she regretted it. One evening, I decided to confront her again, but this time, I was armed with more than just accusations. She came home late, as usual, and found me waiting in the living room, the bank statement spread out on the coffee table. She froze when she saw me, her eyes darting between the papers and my face. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice wary. "You tell me," I replied, gesturing to the statements. "Care to explain why you've been draining our accounts and hiding the money?" Her face went pale, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms defensively. "It's not what you think," she said. "Then what is it?" I pressed, my tone icy. "I was saving for us," she said, stumbling over her words. "I thought it would be a surprise, a safety fund for emergencies." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "A safety fund? Is that what you call sneaking behind my back and lying to my face? Come on, Emily. Give me some credit." Her jaw tightened, and she looked away. "I didn't mean for you to find out this way." "Of course you didn't," I said, standing up. "You didn't mean for me to find out about the money, or Daniel, or the nights at the hotel. You didn't mean for any of it, right?" She flinched at the mention of his name, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. "This isn't fair, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't understand." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't try to justify this. You've been lying to me for months, Emily. You betrayed me, you stole from me, and you expect me to believe you're the victim?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice calm but firm. "And I'm taking everything you've tried to hide. The house, the money. You're not walking away from this unscathed." Her tears turned to anger in an instant. "You can't do this," she shouted. "You can't just take everything." "Watch me," I said, turning my back on her. "You made your choices, Emily. Now you get to live with them." She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, my hands shaking with adrenaline, but also with a strange sense of relief. This was it, the turning point. I wasn't the same man who had been blindsided by her lies. I was stronger now, more determined than ever to take control of my life. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. The next morning, I met with Claire to finalize our strategy. We drafted a list of demands that would leave Emily with little to negotiate. Meanwhile, I instructed the private investigator to dig deeper into Daniel's past. If he thought he could sweep in and play the hero in Emily's life, he was about to learn otherwise. And then, I made the boldest move yet. Using the information Chris had uncovered about Daniel's shady dealings, I contacted one of his former clients, someone who had lost thousands of dollars because of him. "I have evidence that might help you," I told her over the phone, "and I'd like to work together to hold him accountable." The woman, who introduced herself as Karen, was initially hesitant but warmed up when I shared some of the dirt I had on Daniel. She agreed to meet with me, and together, we started building a case against him. one that would not only expose his lies but also drag Emily into the spotlight as his accomplice. By the time I left that meeting, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about making sure neither of them got away with the damage they had caused. The days that followed felt like a strange mix of chaos and calm. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Emily came and went as she always did, acting like we were still a functioning couple. But beneath that facade, I was working tirelessly to dismantle the illusion she had built. One evening, as she sat scrolling through her phone on the couch, I decided to break the silence. I couldn't let her sit there, pretending everything was fine. "You know, Emily," I began, keeping my tone casual, "I've been thinking about how much has changed between us." She glanced up, her expression guarded. "What do you mean?" "I mean the distance," I said, leaning back in my chair. "How we've grown apart. I think we both know this isn't working anymore." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of panic. "Where is this coming from?" she asked carefully. "Just being honest," I replied with a shrug. "I think it's time we stop pretending." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she set her phone down and stared at me, as if trying to gauge whether I was serious. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" she asked, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or anger. "I've already filed," I said, my voice calm. Her face went pale, and for a second, I thought she might cry. But then her expression hardened, and she stood up, crossing her arms defensively. "Fine," she said coldly, "if that's what you want." "It's not about what I want," I said, standing to face her. "It's about what's fair. You've been lying to me, sneaking around, and stealing from me. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she turned on her heel and marched upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. I sat back down, letting out a long breath. This wasn't the way I wanted things to go, but it was the way they had to. Emily had chosen this path, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me any longer. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a run. The crisp air helped clear my head, and by the time I returned home, I felt more focused than ever. I had a meeting with Claire later that day to finalize our approach, and I wanted to make sure everything was in place. When I arrived at her office, Claire greeted me with a confident smile. "You're going to like what I've found," she said, sliding a file across the table. Inside were documents detailing Emily's secret savings account, as well as records of the money she had funneled to Daniel. But that wasn't all. Claire had also uncovered something even more damning. Emily and Daniel had been using my name to secure reservations and purchases, forging my signature to cover their tracks. "This is fraud," Claire said, her tone serious. "If we bring this to court, it's going to hurt her case significantly. And Daniel won't get off easy either." I stared at the documents, a mix of anger and satisfaction bubbling inside me. Emily and Daniel thought they were untouchable, but they'd underestimated me. "What's our next move?" I asked. "We'll file a formal complaint with the court," Claire said. "This will put pressure on her to settle, and it gives us leverage to ensure you walk away with what you deserve." I nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Let's do it." That evening, I returned home to find Emily waiting for me in the living room. Her arms were crossed, and she had that look, the one she used when she wanted to play the victim. "We need to talk," she said as I walked in. I set my keys on the counter and met her gaze. "What about?" "You're being unfair," she said, her voice trembling. "Freezing our accounts, filing for divorce. It's like you're punishing me." "Punishing you?" I repeated, incredulous. "Emily, you betrayed me. You lied, you stole, and you cheated. And now you want to talk about fairness?" She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. "Don't. Just stop. You don't get to play the victim here." She flinched, and for a moment, I thought I saw genuine regret in her eyes. But then she straightened her shoulders, her expression turning cold. "Fine," she said quietly. "If this is how you want it, then so be it." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, feeling both exhausted and vindicated. Later that night, as I sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the evidence Claire had compiled, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control, not just of the situation, but of my life. This wasn't just about exposing Emily anymore. It was about rebuilding, about proving to myself that I was stronger than the betrayal, stronger than the pain. And when this was all over, I would be free. Free to start fresh, free to live without the weight of her lies. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. The court date was set, and Claire worked tirelessly to ensure every piece of evidence was airtight. I stayed focused, juggling work during the day and finalizing the details of my case at night. Emily, on the other hand, was unraveling. I could see it in the way she carried herself, tense, jumpy, and constantly checking her phone. Whatever fantasy world she had built with Daniel was starting to crumble. One night, as I was going through some old files, I heard her pacing upstairs. She'd been doing that a lot lately, her nervous energy filling the house like a storm about to break. Finally, she came downstairs, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Ethan," she said hesitantly, "can we talk?" I looked up, my expression calm but unreadable. "What is it?" She sat down across from me, her eyes darting around the room. "I know I've made mistakes," she began, her voice shaking. "But do we really have to go through with this? Can't we just work things out?" I stared at her, incredulous. "You're serious?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "After everything you've done, you want to work things out?" Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. This was the same woman who had lied to my face, who had stolen from me, and who had laughed with another man while she tore our life apart. "No, Emily," I said firmly. "This isn't something we can fix. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." She sat there for a moment, her tears spilling over, but I didn't waver. This wasn't the time for second chances. As the court date approached, I started hearing whispers about Daniel. Apparently, the investigation I'd helped kick off with his former client was gaining traction. The word on the street was that he was under serious scrutiny for fraud and financial misconduct. One evening, Chris called me with an update. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "Daniel's business is falling apart. He's been hit with multiple lawsuits, and it looks like he's about to go bankrupt." I couldn't help but smile. "Good," I said simply. "He deserves it." But it wasn't just about Daniel anymore. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this was about reclaiming my dignity. For too long, I'd let people take advantage of me. Emily, her parents, even her lover. That was over now. The morning of the court hearing was cold and gray, fitting for the day ahead. I walked into the courtroom with Claire by my side, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. Emily was already there, sitting with her lawyer, looking small and defeated. The proceedings were straightforward. Claire laid out the evidence, the infidelity, the financial misconduct, and the secret savings account. Emily's lawyer tried to counter, but the weight of the evidence was too much. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my words simple and honest. "I loved my wife," I said, my voice steady. "I trusted her, but she broke that trust in ways I never imagined possible. This isn't just about money or property, it's about respect, and that's something I can't compromise on." The judge nodded, her expression serious. By the end of the day, the ruling was clear. The house was mine, the savings account was frozen, and Emily was left with little more than her personal belongings. After the hearing, I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in months. Emily didn't say a word as she left, her shoulders slumped and her head down. That evening, I sat in the empty house, sipping a glass of whiskey and reflecting on everything that had happened. I should have felt victorious, but instead, I felt free. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about starting over. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I renovated the house, changing the spaces that once felt suffocating. I reconnected with friends and started attending social events I'd avoided for years. One day, Chris called with more good news. "Daniel's been arrested," he said. "Turns out, the fraud case stuck, and he's facing serious jail time." I couldn't help but laugh. "Looks like karma finally caught up with him," I said. Emily, meanwhile, had disappeared from my life almost entirely. I heard through mutual friends that she had moved into a small apartment across town, and her relationship with Daniel had imploded. It was poetic in a way. She had traded stability and love for lies and chaos, and now she was paying the price. I didn't reach out to her. There was nothing left to say. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old belongings, I came across a photo album from our early years together. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, remembering the good times we'd shared. But then I closed the album and set it aside. The past was the past, and I wasn't going to let it define me anymore. Life slowly began to take shape again. I started dating casually, enjoying the company of people who appreciated me for who I was. I focused on my career, pouring my energy into projects that excited me. One evening, as I stood on my back porch watching the sunset, I realized something. I was happy. Truly, genuinely happy. Months later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Emily. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I even wanted to read it. But curiosity got the better of me. The letter was short and filled with apologies. She admitted to everything. Her lies, her betrayal, her regret. She said she hoped I could forgive her someday, even if she didn't deserve it. I folded the letter and set it aside. Forgiveness wasn't something I could give her. Not yet. Anyway. But I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt peace. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to turn the page.